special interviews, highlights, and live broadcasts from ICT's annual international conference.
Okay. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Yeah, that's fine. My name is Ehud Ganani, and I'll tell you when my turn will come why am I here and why is it that I'm chairing this exciting panel. As an opening remark, I would just say that I was fascinated to sit here during the course of those 4 days, actually 3 days, we're starting the 4th day, and listen to what's going around in the world of terrorism. I was here last year. It was actually the first time that I could have dedicated myself for the whole 4 days, and oh, it is different. What we were talking about last year is totally different from what we're facing today. Just a quote from one of the presentations: number of casualties over the last 50 years as a result of terrorism. Between the 70s and the 80s, it was measured in the tenths of casualties around the world. Between the 80s and the 90s, it was already in the hundreds. 2000, we're measuring in the thousands of casualties every year, and doesn't call for being a too bright mathematician to do the extrapolation that in the coming decades we'll probably look at a much higher number, and that definitely calls for sitting here in a session dedicated to the non-conventional terrorism. Another term that was used was the we're very good with acronyms here, especially in the military area in Israel, but nobody is second to the Americans, and the term was COTW, conflict other than war. That term was used in the 70s, when until the 70s we had wars, and then we had COTW. We actually in Israel live here in a constant state of COTW, which has been since actually we fought the last declared war, which was the Yom Kippur War. And since then we lived through an operation to an operation to an operation, and today it is the war on terror. That's our reality. We heard a lot, and we will probably hear today as well, about the determination, the ambition, the horrific plans, and the skills of the organizations that we're fighting today. And last year I spoke with Boaz, and I asked him, because of what I'm doing here, maybe to dedicate a panel to deal with the non-conventional terrorism, and I'm glad that it settled and we're here being able to talk about the non-conventional terrorism. Now, this is a definition which intuitively is tied with the CBRN, or weapon of mass destruction, and I guess that most of the speakers here are going to look into these areas, some in more general terms and some being more specific. So it is my honor and pleasure to head that panel. We're under constraints. We're competing with an unfair competition with the Prime Minister that decided in the course of this week that after seeing all of his ministers appear in front of us, that he's not going to miss the opportunity, and that's why we called you to be here at 9 o'clock, and we're going to be out of the room by 11:30. That would call for and heightened level of discipline on our side. I'm not sure that we're going to have too much time for Q&A because I am using the opportunity to present you with a world premiere of a movie that will be seen in the public for the first time here in this auditorium. But I leave that as a dessert. My pleasure to call up Professor Adam Dolnik to be the first speaker and give us an overview of the whole topic. Professor Dolnik is a professor of terrorism studies at the University of Wollongong in Australia. He had delivered lectures and training courses on terrorism and hostage negotiations for various governmental and non-governmental organizations and agencies in over 50 countries, and regularly conducts field research in conflict zones. I must refer you to the ICT website where the CVs of all the speakers are much more elaborate, and I'm sure that I missed a lot of exciting details. Professor Dolnik, please. Oh, you're going to do that.
Okay, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I have the pleasure and curse of speaking to you on the topic of mass casualty, CBR, and terrorism, sometimes also referred to as weapons of mass destruction, terrorism. I will say that this is a topic that I started studying in the mid-1990s, where it was especially topical following the attacks of the Aum Shinrikyo on the Kasumigaseki station in central Tokyo, which I will remind you killed 12 people and injured over 1,000. At that point in time, there was a lot of panic. People were expecting that every other terrorist group is going to do this from now on. We had dire predictions of tens of thousands of people perishing in acts of chemical or biological terrorism over the next decades. It has not materialized. And it's an interesting question to ask the question why that might be the case, where our assessments overblown. We also should think about the psychology of analysts. I mean, if you're an analyst, and you say, you know, doom and gloom is going to happen within 10 years, and you're wrong, nobody remembers, right? Well, if you say it's never going to happen, and you're very skeptical about the threat, and you're wrong, then your career is basically finished. So this is one of the reasons why I think there is no other topic in the world of terrorism studies which is so controversial as the issue of mass casualty, CBR, and terrorism. I mean, you can present a room full of experts with exactly the same evidence, and everyone will have a completely different opinion on that topic. How is that even possible? Well, let's talk about some of these issues. Once again, I had this graph in my earlier presentation yesterday on terrorist innovation, and it also turned out to be like this. So, in the most basic terms, any terrorist attack, especially CBR and terrorist attack, will happen when you have the motivation of a specific non-state actor to acquire and use a CBRN agent for attack purposes. And this will have to overlap with the capability to acquire and successfully weaponize and deliver that particular agent. And finally, the target needs to be vulnerable to that particular form of attack which that particular actor is motivated to use. Much of the assessments that we've seen historically have focused on the vulnerability aspect. We're very vulnerable. We see the potential consequences of CBR and terrorism. We don't worry so much about the motivation, and we worry a bit more about capability as a limitation. But motivation sometimes is taken for granted. But it is actually quite more complicated than people assume. What are some of the reasons why groups might be interested in CBRN? Well, seeking mass casualties is one of those reasons. If you truly want to kill tens of thousands of people, CBN would be the way to do this. Fascination with CBRN agents as kind of modern weapons of the future is another potential reason, and we've seen a number of groups, including the aforementioned Aum Shinrikyo, to be among this lineup. The covert nature of some agents may make them attractive. We saw a group like the Minnesota Patriots Council in 1991 in the US who were attracted to ricin precisely because it was seen as the secret weapon of the KGB and CIA. And they saw this leaflet in Maynard Angel's Supplies, which was a ad in a right-wing magazine, and they thought we're going to be cool like secret agents. Let's do this. They were not necessarily motivated by mass casualties. The role of a precedent might be important. We see that a lot in terrorism, that terrorists tend to copy successes of other groups, as Brian spoke about it yesterday in the panel on innovation. Prestige among terrorists may be another motivator. If you want to be remembered forever, if you're a megalomaniac, then perhaps attacking with CBRN is something that puts you on the map, and we certainly do see some terrorist personalities who have that predisposition. Dead-end groups might be another potential candidate for use of CBRN. There may be many different political, even ethical constraints for terrorist groups to go all in. But if they're on the verge of defeat, perhaps they have the motivation to actually go all in because they don't worry about the constituency reaction as much anymore. And the Tamil Tigers at a particular point were a good candidate for this specific motivation. And finally, extortion or bargaining with the state via demonstrating a credible CBRN capability. That would, of course, increase the prestige of a group, but also their bargaining potential. So those are some of the reasons. I'll mention again that when it comes to intent, in the last 13 years, that's not what we debate very much. People assume that the intent of at least some groups like Al-Qaeda to kill tens of thousands of people by any means necessary is a given. And we do have these statements, which, some of them actually taken quite out of context. But we do have these statements where Al-Qaeda tells us it's not a debate, we do want these weapons and we want to kill as many of you as we possibly can. But one thing that I always argue is that there is more to establishing motivation of an actor to use CBRN in the future than just the desire to kill a lot of people. What does it really mean to have the intent to acquire or use CBRN? It actually takes not just the decision to kill a lot of people, but to do it in a particular way. It takes a decision to invest money and resources to have a long-term plan to acquire this type of technology, to potentially risk health problems by handling pathogens which you may not be equipped to deal with. You also need continuity. What if you have one top weapons expert? Great. If he's eliminated in a targeted strike, your entire program is gone. And why invest millions of dollars in this direction when you haven't yet exploited the killing potential of conventional weapons, which you already know how to use, right? So there are many nuances, and one of the things I want to highlight is the issue of innovation. In order to understand whether a terrorist group might or may not use CBRN weapons, we need to understand how innovative that group is. Because for any existing terrorist organization to go on the path of CBRN is a radical departure from their conventional capability and requires a lot of innovation. So what does the history and the patterns in innovation of the last 50 years tell us about terrorist organizations to make that leap? Well, first of all, we have concluded in the panel yesterday, I think quite universally, that terrorist organizations tend to be quite conservative in their MOs. If you look at every single terrorist attack recorded since 1945, it makes for very boring reading. Very rarely does something jump out at you as being very creative or innovative. You expect it to be there, but it really isn't there. Of course, terrorists do improve over time in their operational art. But really, it's just incremental improvement, more so than radical innovation that a group may require to be able to acquire the CBRN capability. When we do see actual technological improvements, it's mainly at the level of delivery and concealment of explosive devices. And we spoke yesterday about the aviation industry and the kind of tit-for-tat mini arms race between terrorists and security forces. This is where most innovation occurs. But it's at the incremental level of finding new, novel ways of overcoming security measures. Again, it's not a quantum leap toward mass destruction, which begs the question, are terrorists unwilling or simply unable to innovate? Another important issue is if you look at the most lethal terrorist organizations, like the Armed Islamic Group and Al-Qaeda and others, they actually tend to be not that innovative when it comes to technology. They tend to use quite crude methods. Lord's Resistance Army, many of the militias in the Democratic Republic of Congo, which you don't even call terrorists, hence they don't even figure in our statistics on terrorism. There are a number of different triggers for innovation, which I won't go deeply into, but there are specific situations in which terrorist groups have innovated, and we can identify these beforehand. There is a clear pattern. If you're interested in this debate more, you can take a look at this book, which I wrote now almost 10 years ago, where I looked at some of the factors that I hypothesized to be responsible for the varying degrees of innovation that you see in the population of terrorist groups. Some groups are extremely conservative throughout their entire lifespan, and some are very innovative right from the beginning. What is it that accounts for that specific difference? And there are a number of factors that play a role here, including ideology and strategy, including the decision-making dynamics, just to pick one. If you look at the Aum Shinrikyo, it was a group that was well-positioned to innovate because they had Shoko Asahara, Chizuo Matsumoto by his real name, who was a tinker, even had a couple of patents, really wanted to come up with something new, really wanted to distinguish himself. There was a specific personal reward in that. So they were well-positioned to basically impose an innovation culture within the group. They were ideologically predisposed to innovation simply because they had a cosmic ideology. They had the belief of destroying the world in order to save it. They looked at an earthquake machine. They looked at a giant laser with which you could split the earth like a boy would split an apple, as they said in Aum Shinrikyo propaganda. So they were well positioned to be innovative. At the same time, the innovation culture within the group was hampered by the cult of personality of Asahara. You had no less than 26 scientists with PhDs in relevant disciplines working for the group. But they were so obsessed with getting favors from Asahara. They all wanted to please him. So anytime he would dream up something totally bizarre, they would say, yes, sir, we can do that for you. And their scientific judgment was completely put aside because they simply wanted to please the guru. So there are internal dynamics, there are external dynamics that can drive innovation, but we have a limited amount of time. So I won't go into this too deeply. What I'll say is that when we look at the track record, I find it very useful to compare the Aum Shinrikyo with Al-Qaeda. And, for the last 13 years, we heard that an Al-Qaeda CBRN terrorist attack at mass casualty levels is inevitable. Well, if you actually compare what these groups had in terms of capability, it's quite interesting. Aum Shinrikyo had up to $1 billion in assets, richer than any other terrorist organization. They had many legitimate businesses. They were a truly global firm. Compare that with the $2,000 to $4,000 investment that Al-Qaeda put toward the so-called Project Yogurt, which was a bioweapons program. You compare the scientific base. Aum Shinrikyo's bioweapons program was run by Seiichi Endo, who was a PhD from Kyoto University with relevant expertise that would be useful. And yet, Aum Shinrikyo failed to kill a single person with no less than 12 attacks, which they tried with biological weapons. You compare that with the expertise of Yasid Sufad, who was a Malaysian army captain with a bachelor's in biological sciences from University of California in Sacramento, not necessarily your top-notch scientist. You compare the laboratories. The chemical weapons lab of Al-Qaeda in Fallujah. This is just the cooling system of the Satyen 7 facility that the Aum Shinrikyo had. So, if the best that Aum Shinrikyo could do was 12 people killed in 20 attacks that they put together, that was their most successful attack. What does that give you in terms of a perspective on Al-Qaeda? Now, of course, we can't be too stagnant in this, and I would say that the Islamic State now, both at the level of motivation and actual capability to conduct experiments freely on their own turf where they're not challenged, presents a much greater threat in this regard. So we can't be too stagnant. Let me just go into conclusions because my time is up and I have 1.5 minutes left. What I'll say is that, yes, CBRN agents are a threat. We should not discount it completely. And yet, mass casualty CBRN terrorism is certainly not imminent. And I would even say it's not inevitable. We need to better understand small-scale scenarios. Too much of this debate is about, doom and gloom, tens of thousands of people killed versus nothing. There are small-scale scenarios which will be comparable to conventional terrorism in terms of how many people they kill, and yet they will have a very disproportionate psychological impact, which is really where the strength of CBRN will lie, more so than in the mass destruction that we tend to associate with these weapons. If you look historically, the groups that have tried this are pretty bizarre actors. They're not your traditional LTT, Hamas, IRA, Hezbollah, Al-Qaeda. They're freak groups with cult-like characteristics that pursue CBRN for very bizarre motivations. So this is also something to say that we can identify many of these actors based on specific characteristics that they have. Last two comments. One relates to the IRA sentence after the Brighton bomb failed to kill Margaret Thatcher, where they said, today we were unlucky, but remember, we only have to be lucky once, we have to be lucky always. Any student of terrorism has heard this a million times. Actually, this is great news because in the realm of CBR and terrorism, it goes the other way. The terrorists have to be lucky every step of the way that it takes to acquire CBRN capability. We only have to be lucky once to stop them, right? So there is really no reason for panic and fear. This is a topic we should devote debate to, but by fearing it so much, we're only fulfilling the terrorist overall perspective. So finding that balance when we can put enough effort and resources and debate toward debating what the threat might be and anticipating it, while at the same time not fulfilling the core objective of fearing. That's the real counterterrorism dilemma we're dealing with. Thank you so much.
Adam, thank you very much. Exciting introduction to this whole panel. And I owe you a smiley for being very disciplined on time. The next speaker will be Professor Pinchas Dickstein. Professor Dickstein is a research fellow in the International Institute for Counter-Terrorism and a founder and the CEO of Dr. Pinchas Dickstein Technologies, Ltd. He earned his doctorate of engineering from the Technion and his MA in Government Counter-Terrorism Policy from the IDC. His main subjects of interest and activities in the frame of ICT are the non-conventional terror and the history of terror in South America in the 20th century. And Dr. Dickstein is going to, I would phrase it, if you don't mind, as the essentials of nuclear terrorism or the nuclear terrorism 101. Please.
Okay, good morning. I was asked to speak about some essentials of nuclear terror, not much into politics, but to show what we really mean with nuclear terrorism. And I'm a physicist, and as you will show from the slides, that's part of the emphasis that we'll give. Nuclear terror references: the former Director General of the International Atomic Energy Agency declared that nuclear terrorism is the most serious dangers the world is facing. President Obama expressed the same. Nuclear terrorism is the most immediate and extreme threat to global security, and also some other politicians like Merkel from Germany and others, all of them show the same idea or the same declaration. Just to make it for everybody here, nuclear radiation, unstable nuclei stabilize themselves by emitting energy, electromagnetic, different types of particles, splitting, fission, and releasing energy. This is energy that can burn, that can break molecules, that can make biological damage and can kill. If we talk about a nuclear device, we talk about the fission. The fission is a neutron comes to an unstable nuclei. It becomes more unstable. I'm sorry, I'm a physicist, but I talk like in literature. It becomes more unstable, then it splits. While splitting, it emits energy, and where you split at the same time a lot of unstable atoms, this energy amounts to a nuclear bomb. And here, when the big atom splits into two smaller ones, you lose some mass, and then this mass becomes energy, and that's the famous. That's the last equations that I'm using. Okay. We need a chain reaction because if only one atom splits, it's not enough energy to cause damage, but if many splits at the same time, it causes the damage, the biological or other damage, and then we see what's a chain reactor, that many neutrons come out of a fission, and they split other atoms, and all this energy comes out in a nuclear blast. Critical mass, you have to have the smallest amount of the fissionable material in which self-sustained chain reactor can happen. It means that it's not enough to have a feasible material that can fission, but you have to have enough of it, a certain amount of it. The critical mass depends on several factors. For example, in Hiroshima, there was a bomb that contained 25 kilograms of enriched uranium, and in Nagasaki, it was 8 kilos of plutonium. So that's the amount. We talk kilograms, not tens of kilograms even, maybe 25 years. The main effect of a nuclear bomb, energy manifestation, it's a blast. 50% of the energy goes into blast. The blast from TNT, from chemical bomb, You see sometimes in the movie there is a blast and people are flying away and all. The duration of the blast from a nuclear explosion, it's 1,000 times larger in terms of time than the blast of a chemical bomb. So you imagine the blast going on and on and on and on and on. Heat and light, 35%. It can reach 10 million Celsius to 10 million degrees Celsius, immediate radiation and fallout. How nuclear terror can manifest itself? It's either deliberate exposure to radioactive materials, like to poison someone, like it happened in Britain, or just put a source in a park in Russia that was also in Moscow. It can manifest itself as an attack on a nuclear power station. It will not cause a nuclear explosion, but it will cause the release of radioactive materials and aerosols. One can make a dirty bulb, which I'll elaborate a minute later, an atomic bomb, a nuclear device which is capable of producing all the blast heat and everything that we mentioned the slide ago. The dirty bomb is probably the most easiest way to manifest nuclear terror. It's an explosive radiation, a bomb that is surrounded with or contains radioactive materials, and when the TNT bursts, the material is scattered and spread around. This is a weapon of mass destruction rather than mass destruction, because if you are not killed by the TNT, you won't be killed by the radiation. But yet it causes lots of panic, and that's the main business of terror in that sense. The contamination impact depends on side of the bomb and some other factors. The main outcomes are deaths from the explosives, not from the radiation. Contamination of buildings or blocks, months to clean up, which also has economical consequences. Panic, socio-psychological and economic impacts. Huge psychological effects, mainly because radiation is not sensed by humans, so there is some sort of phobia. Not every source is suitable for creating this bomb, and I have to rush out because I was asked to make it shorter. I want to talk a bit about radiological accident in Guiana, Brazil, which was an accident. It was not a dirty bomb, but one can learn a bit about the social psychological aspects of what can happen. A scrapyard worker opens a lead canister that was scavenged from an abandoned cancer treatment center and dumped at the yard 5 days earlier. Inside the canister, the man is delighted to find a sparkling blue powder, radioactive cesium. Curious residents living near the junkyard pass the canister from home to home for nearly a week because it's so glowing, so nice, some blue color. Deaths of 4 people, including a 6-year-old girl who rubbed the powder over the body so she can shine from the body. She didn't know what it was. About 300 residents exposed and needed treatment, a certain degree. Radioactivity contaminated soil, business, and homes. 85 of them are leveled during the cleanup process. The radiological, now I'm talking about the psycho effect of this. Hospital staff dealing with radiation patients boycotted by their families because the families didn't want the doctors to pass the virus, the radiation virus. Victims and families attacked for spreading the radiation virus. Psychometric effects among the contamination team members, which are professionals, but they also experienced psychosomatic effects. More than 100,000 residents show in for checkup, mostly psychosomatic, because no way they were around or near the site, yet more than 100,000 people felt that they had some sort of disease. Students from Ganani were expelled from university in other cities. Cars with Guyana plates were stoned in other cities. Products from Guyana taken off the shelves in other parts of the country. Violence and fights between residents and deco technicians, fatigue and exhaustion among the International Atomic Energy Commission experts that came to aid the Brazilians. So after 2 weeks, they had to replace them with other experts, and these are the experts. So the panic and the psychological effect are clear. Returning to nuclear terror, there are coordinated atomic devices. In the 80s, special atomic demolition units, small. There are two kinds here. One of them was supposed. Time is up? No. Okay. So the one on your left was sort of to be brought by a submarine or something and then floated towards the shore and explode there. And the other one is a suitcase bomb. Each of them could yield the same amount of destruction actions, like 5 to 30% of Hiroshima as a reference. General Lebanon missing Saddams. Now, in 1997, please make sure you see this question sign here, because what I'm saying is some sort of debate. In 1997, meeting with Senate members, and in 60 minutes, there are about 100 missing Saddams from the USSR area that were controlled by the KGB, suitcase size, one person to operate 20 minutes, 5% Hiroshima. I don't know their location. I don't know whether they have been destroyed, stored, sold, or stolen. A fierce denial by Russia, discredited or labeled, and U.S. intelligence response, we don't know with any confidence what has gone missing, and neither do they. So there is a big question about it. Did they really disappear or not? Sir? You're running for president, and the people from 60 Minutes that talked to him just published a book, and this interview with Lebed could raise the sale of the book. And there is a huge chapter, or a great chapter, describing all this, and my friends Jenkins sitting here, describing all this situation. But the interview was made, and there is always a little slight, the speculation that maybe he was right, but he disappeared after that. Nobody heard of him. And I have a great joke, but I don't have time now. But I skip this. Okay, fact, the hardest part of making a nuclear bomb is acquiring the fissile material. That's the hardest part, because no other technological, everything you can overcome. You need the fissile material. Highly enriched uranium or plutonium, how difficult to get, not hard. That's official from the FAQ of the International Atomic Agency. I didn't see once nuclear materials acquired possibility to make a nuclear weapon, so to improvise a nuclear weapon. Amount needed to make a crude nuclear bomb is 25 kilos, like Hiroshima. The global stockpile of enriched uranium amounts to 1,600,000 kilos stored in somewhere in several places in the world. Amount of PU needed, plutonium, 8 kilograms, global stockpile of plutonium, suitable for nuclear devices is 500,000 kilograms. Number of bombs that can be built with the current stockpile, more than 200,000. Bomb worth of fissile material stolen, more than one, but most probable more than that. Could terrorists steal or buy enriched uranium or plutonium? Yes. Incidents of reported theft, that's official report from the International Atomic Energy Agency. Incidents of reported theft of nuclear materials, for more than 400. Every country ever lost a nuclear weapon? Yes. Submarines that sunk and other opportunities. Could terrorists target a nuclear reactor to cause a nuclear explosion? No. The nuclear reactor can emit radiation and aerosols that are not, but there's no nuclear explosion from that. Deficiencies in the International Atomic Energy, I skipped that because they published a lot of guides and they take very seriously the case of security. I recommend to go into their site and see all the publications that they have on it. But the deficiencies in their activities that relate to groups defined as terrorist only. So if a group is not defined by the UN as a terrorist, they don't deal or they don't look after it. It assumes that all UN member states are united in the struggle against nuclear terrorism, which we can doubt it. And also it doesn't address terror activities promoted or supported by states, only by those groups that are defined by United Nations as terrorists. Manifestation, maybe if I have time later. Nuclear terror and Al-Qaeda. Osama bin Laden declaration on the nuclear bomb of Islam stating that it is the duty of Muslims to prepare as much force as possible to terrorize the enemies of God. Zawahiri, his successor, on 2008 gave the same idea. And another official statement by the International Atomic Agency is that 4 terrorist groups have demonstrated interest in acquiring nuclear weapons. They cite Al-Qaeda, Chechnya-based separatists, Lashkar-e-Taiba, and Aoun Shirinkyo. The Taliban and Hezbollah are mentioned as groups that may be capable of acquiring and using nuclear weapons. nuclear weapons and Al-Qaeda continued. Muslim scholars have already published the fatwas allowing the encouragement. So the intention has been declared by Zawahiri and bin Laden. The religious and moral support and motivation have been already provided. Actual attempts to acquire nuclear materials have been reported, and terrorists have already used non-conventional terror, so perhaps if they have it, they use it. Only technical issues have hampered so far the use of nuclear terror, but let me tell you that these issues may be resolved quite easily. Some statements from WikiLeaks. Al-Qaeda has a nuclear bomb to be detonated if bin Laden is captured, is executed. Well, a few years passed, but they didn't do it, but that was a declaration from WikiLeaks. They declared the device is held somewhere in Europe. The information was obtained from Guantanamo, provided by Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the brain behind the 9/11. Al-Qaeda is planning a massive terror attack, which they call nuclear storms, and Al-Qaeda is planning a chemical and biological attack as well, some sort of combined operation. According to WikiLeaks, for example, cyanide in ventilation system of published institute, etc. Sub-Saharan terrorist groups reported to have been trying to acquire a nuclear device. There are reports that about 100 Saddam are missing, with a question mark. Radical Muslims have already gotten the fatwas that permit and encourage to use nuclears against the enemy. So there might be a few questions, if or when or why and whatever, but I will leave this to my friend who will talk about this issue later. I was supposed to give only the basic essentials, and I guess I'm in time.
You're perfect.
Okay.
In light of the fact that I have so far a very disciplined team, there's room for one comment or one question from the audience.
Please. Very quick question. One concept that has not been brought out is the response of the victimized society. If the attack is too strong, too much, could it be possible we could turn the victim society into Popeye? In other words, I can't stand it anymore, break the law, and annihilate the group. An example would be two. One would be Colombia with the drug war and Pablo Escobar, where at some point the society said we had enough, and basically vigilante action was taken against the criminals and the families, and eventually he was brought down. And the second example is after 26 years of the civil war in Sri Lanka, the Buddhists finally said we've had enough of the Tamil tigers, and they basically annihilated them. So the question I ask to the panel, is this response of too big a mega catastrophe in the equation?
Adam, would you like to take it?
I basically counted for that when I spoke about dead-end groups as a scenario where all the motivational constraints that a normal terrorist group has, how using these weapons, might be broken because they have nothing to lose. At the same time, in order for a group to actually perpetrate a mass casualty CBRN attack, they would have to have that capability already in place. And if you have a group that wasn't motivated to do it in the first place, it's not something you get overnight. So it's one of those potential possibilities, but it doesn't make me believe that it's any closer as an event.
Okay, thank you. As a continuation to Dr. Dickstein presentation about that gave us the essentials of nuclear devices, I'll be talking about a subset in that area, which is the electromagnetic pulse. I'm going to talk about what it is, the very basic definitions, because most of the crowd are not physicists or engineers. I won't spend too much time on that. I will talk about protection that we believe we ought to take seriously. I'm going to talk about recommendations. The EIS Council, which is the entity that I work for here in Israel, is collaborating with both the Israeli Electric Company, because at the end of the day, there's going to be no electricity. This is the responsibility of the utility provider. in our country and in any other country. And we're working very closely with the Ministry of Energy, which is, again, in our country, this is the ministry who is in charge of providing electricity and maintaining the continuity of this essential service. The EAS Council, let's take a step back. Until the year 2000, EMP was discussed thoroughly only in highly classified arenas. It was solely the interest of powers, superpowers that had nuclear or strategic capabilities, and it was dealt in the context of preserving that capability for the second, third, or fourth strike and developing immune systems. In the year 2000, US Congress realized that our entire society is dependent upon one critical infrastructure, and that's electricity. And electricity, the electrical grid, is extremely vulnerable to an EMP phenomena. And there were two congressional committees. One published its results in 2004 and the second one in 2008 that got the DOE, DOD, DHS, and different other industries and some modern countries like the UK and Scandinavian countries. And the conclusion of few very active congressmen in the US and some parliament members was that we, the governments of the free world, are too heavy, are too complicated, and we would like an NGO, not-for-profit organization, to help us get together at least once a year, help us do research, help us get our hands around a lot of know-how which is out there, and that's the EAS Council. We hold international conferences once a year, alternating between Capitol Hill and Westminster Palace. We did our 5th summit about 2 months ago. We work closely with the utility industries. We work closely with all the government agencies. We have delegates from 28 countries. And we're about to complete a 2-year project that will be launched in December of this year, which is the ePro Handbook. Very, very similar to the IEEE handbook that every electrical engineer who needs to address anything from standards to equipment to procedures go and use the reference book. So we're going to have on the internet this coming December a handbook which is going to be about that thick with all the information that we can put our hands on. Until then, we have a very, very, very elaborate website, which I'll be glad to leave cards of mine for you to visit and see what you have. We're based mostly in the US, in the UK, and as I said, as of last year, we also have a representative here in Israel. EMP. EMP, an electromagnetic pulse, can be generated in one of 3 mechanisms. The first one, which obviously is the reason for all of us being in this room, is a nuclear explosion over the atmosphere. I mean, that can be done at heights starting off at 20 kilometers and higher. The higher that we rise, the bigger the footprint of that pulse is. And we'll dive into that later. The second mechanism is local. Everybody who served in a technical branch that is using radars know that the first thing that they teach you is you don't walk in front of the radar antenna because it does emit RF, radio frequency electromagnetic waves, and just take that concept and put it on a truck or in a suitcase or inside a van, and it can generate local radiation, which has a similar effect that we get out of an explosion of a nuclear device on the atmosphere. And the third one, this is out of proportion, those charts. This is the sun. We're very aware to a severe terrestrial weather that happens every now and then on the face of the earth. I think we are less aware of severe sunstorms that actually happen every minute. But the sun is there and we are here. And this thing had been going on for the last 4.5 billion years. But unfortunately, humankind was able to measure and understand those phenomena only for the last 200 years. So the common understanding is that phenomena of coronal mass ejection, which is a tsunami in space. The numbers are mind-boggling. It's 10 to the 16 kilograms of charged particles traveling at a speed of 3,000 kilometers per second. And once every 100 to 150 years, it reaches the Earth, and it creates the same EMP effect as we get from a nuclear device. The last time that it happened in a global scale was 1921. The time before that was 1859. A physicist by the name of Carrington, which that phenomena is called after him. He's British, understood and explained that phenomena. And we have a visitor here from Canada that actually witnessed in 9 seconds 6 million people in Quebec back in 1989 lost power. How long did it take the guys to recover it? A week. Right. So this is for real. I'm not trying to compete with your technical charts. This is the pulse depicted in volts per meter and on a logarithmic time scale, just to get you close to something that every one of us thinks that he knows. That E2 pulse is the pulse that we get when we stand where a lightning hits. It's about 100 volts per meter, and it lasts about 1/100th of a second. Now, the EMP, the typical EMP pulse from a nuclear device are either the E1, which is about 100,000 volts per meter and lasts less than a nanosecond, or a longer pulse that starts at about 100 seconds, is much lower in intensity, but that pulse is the big threat to the electrical grid, and I'll explain why. The two superpowers that dealt with nuclear devices, the Russians were actually the first ones years before the tests that I'm going to tell you realized, because they were conducting tests in the Kola Peninsula and had the Archangel and Murmansk urban areas, and they realized for years what effect those high-altitude explosions had over electronics and the electrical grid. They didn't settle for that, and in 1962, in October, they wanted to test that for real, and they exploded a device at 290 kilometers over Kazakhstan. And they actually did that in 6 different tests, and they realized what's listed over here. Power stations were burnt out, underground power lines were fused, above-ground power lines were destroyed, phone lines were shut down, and the 1962 type of electronics was damaged. The Americans, about a few months before the Russians did that, actually in July of 1962, exploded at 400 kilometers over the Johnston Island, a 1.4 megaton device, which is smaller than the Hiroshima. At the same time, they launched 33 sounding rockets with sensors. They did not predict how strong the effect would have been because most of the sensors went off the chart. However, the Russians shared the information openly with the Americans only in 1994. That test was discovered immediately because that picture was taken 45 miles away from Hawaii, where the wave caused about 300 streetlights to be knocked off. One power station was damaged. A microwave communication data link was destroyed. So there's no doubt. I mean, this mechanism can cause a lot of damage. The damage that is envisioned as a result of high-altitude explosion would be no electricity. No electricity, no electronic chips will be destroyed as a result of the E1, and everything that is tied with the electrical grid would just shut down. No flowing water, no sewer, no communication for rescue operations. Transportation would get to a grid. And there are two ways to deal with it. I mean, there is the way of, let's say, it's not going to happen to us, and let's do nothing, and then it's going to take years to recover. The U.S. EMP Commission ran a scenario that it's going to take a year to recover. Now, in the course of 2 years, 200 million Americans are going to die. Now, the other method would be to say, yeah, I mean, the chances are slim, but let's see what we can do in such a scenario. Preparation, mapping, where are the sensitive elements in our grid that should be replaced, buy enough spares, do training on a national scale, and then we can recover within a matter of weeks. And that's definitely going to be much better news. And the fact that modern countries are preparing themselves is also a deterrent in a way, because there's no point in going into this whole operation of that scenario if your adversary, or actually if you, the target, is prepared for such scenario. I would like to quote 5 sentences that were published openly in an unclassified Senate testimony by Dr. Peter Pry, who was the staff director of the Congressional EMP Commission, addressing 5 points that were discussed. Dr. Pry is going to be in Israel on the 28th of October of this year. We're going to hold a 2 days international conference at the INSS dealing exclusively with the security of the grid. So save the date, it's going to be interesting. So Dr. Pry talks about the Shihab-3 launches, which are considered a likely EMP configuration test. And he said, Iranian flight tests that can reach Israel and the US forces in the Persian Gulf have in recent years involved several explosions at high altitude. Now, when the West was monitoring those tests, initially the reaction was those tests were failures because they noticed explosions at 50 kilometers and then one at 200 kilometers. But then they say, oh, wait a minute, this is an EMP scenario. Exploding a device at 50 kilometers, that's perfect for Israel, and one at 200 kilometers, that's perfect for the US. Iran practiced sea launches of medium-range missiles. Iran also successfully tested firing a Scud missile from a vessel in the Caspian Sea. A nuclear missile concealed in a freighter would give Iran or terrorists the capability to perform an EMP attack against the United States homeland. Actually, it doesn't have to be a very, very accurate delivery system. The North Koreans last year tried to smuggle a freighter through the Panama Canal, and 2 Scud missiles, no nuclear devices, but 2 Scud missiles were found under huge heaps of sugar sacks. So somebody was trying to see whether it's doable. It's on the internet. Iranian open source writing on EMP were monitored. Published Iranian analysts included use of nuclear weapons to destroy cities that include electromagnetic pulse for the destruction of unprotected circuits. This is open literature, professional literature published by the Iranians. Now, something that probably Uzi Eilam is going to challenge, or I'm challenging Uzi, is the statement that nuclear capability is available to nuclear terrorists. Iran continues to develop the capability to make nuclear weapons. North Korea broke the NPT to build and test nuclear weapons. North Korea was recently helping terrorist sponsors Syria to build nuclear weapon capability. Pakistan is unstable, and its nuclear missile could fall into the hands of governments sympathetic to terrorists. China and Russia are unpredictable and have already sold in the past sensitive nuclear and missile technologies to Iran, Libya, Pakistan, Iraq under Saddam, and to North Korea. And last but not least, and again I'm going back to what Professor Dolnik mentioned, EMP offers the biggest bang for the buck. That's what Peter Pry said in Congress. Could cause far more damage and kill many more Americans or Israelis in the long run than an A-bomb exploded in any city. 9/11 Commission concluded that the terror attacks on New York and DC were calculated not only to maximize casualties, but to damage the economy and for symbolism. All good reasons for a nuclear EMP attack. I'm horrible in terms of keeping my time. This sets a very bad example to the other speakers, so I will skip this one. Believe me, this is all on the internet. EMP, intentional. Go on the internet. If you want to buy one, just Google EMP simulator. People are selling those devices, and they call them simulators. I saw 2 years ago in London the suitcase. It weighs 20 kilograms. If I put it here on that table, every electronic device in the room is going to be damaged. If you want to be more aggressive and you want to build a device that weighs 1 ton and you put it in a truck, that gets a range of 400 meters. And imagine where can we reach to at such a distance. The sun, again, NOVA, this is a series by National Geographic, has done a great job in putting together few videos, 45 to 50 minutes, highly recommended, and that would tell you all about why the sun does that, what are the effects. I will skip this one as well, and I will just make the point that the electrical grid is a target. Terrorist attacks over the last 18 months, I just give 3 examples out of more than that. The first one, probably the Americans have heard about that, in California near San Jose. Metcalf had nothing to do with EMP or non-nuclear, but the fact was that a group of terrorists cut the lines, communication lines, and shot about 100 bullets into 17 transformers, took out electricity. 420,000 people were left out for 27 days. That's what it took to recover service. In Mexico, in Michoacan, drug dealers took out 6 transformation stations, no service, no communication for an area that had about 430,000 people. The reason that they did that was that they wanted to use the time and the lack of communication to execute some village leaders that were opposing the trade. And last but not least, Yemen. In one night, for 24 hours, 23 million people had no power because of, in kilometer 78, terrorists took out those 2 huge poles, which are the high voltage transmission lines. So people, our adversaries, understand how vulnerable we are and how dependent is our society upon electricity. And I wouldn't repeat that. I mean, a lot of it said, the intent is there. This is a quote from World Net Daily, which is an internet daily news published in the US of a lawyer who lives in Beirut interviewing one of the ISIS leaders, and they definitely say, we have access to nuclear devices. We will not hesitate. They have a stockpile of nuclear weapons. By the way, they don't have to build them. They have about 200 weapons available in unstable Pakistan, which is a very strong supporter of the Sunni movement. Yeah, I'm done. My message is that the clock is ticking. Even if we can debate whether there is intent or a capability, it's a matter of weeks between the time that a terrorist group is going to get their hands on a device and will start moving the operation. It's going to take us years to build up the protection capability and build a resilient system. So there will be no time, if we find the intent, to build a resilient system. And that's my last message. Sorry that I ran out of time, but I think it was worth it. The next, no room for questions. Okay. The next speaker is Dr. Gadi Frischman, who is going to take us from the nuclear domain to another domain. Dr. Frischman is a research fellow at the ICT. He has 25 years of experience in detection of atmospheric toxic material, developing of personal and collective protection means against chemical and biological compounds, as well as risk assessment evaluation for different kinds of scenarios. Dr. Frischman served at the head of the NBC Protection Division at the Ministry of Defense from 2007 to 2010. Can you help us here?
Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you for the organizing committee to giving me the opportunity to talk about chemical terrorism. I will start with a very short historical perspective of chemical terrorism, and I will focus on the characteristics of chemical agent. As you already told, I'm a chemist, so my main topic will be on this subject. And at the end of the presentation, I will ask what changed since August 2013. Very quickly about the threat potential component. It's of course a function of probability and damage, and the probability is the intention or the motivation, and the ability. Well, the ability is of course the access for knowledge and for resources. I'm going to focus on the danger, on the chem threat only, by facing what's happened in Syria. So let's start very quickly with the unconventional terror event, the recent unconventional terror event. And That starts in 1978, while ricin, which is a toxin, produced from the seed of castor oil, very easy to get, very easy to produce, and very potent as well. This toxin was stabbed into a BBC journalist. Then on 92, we get the Thailand capsules were tempered with cyanide. 7 people were died. 1919, chlorine gas used to assault the Sri Lankan armed forces. Just to mention that chlorine gas was used extensively already in the First World War. 1993, New York, First World Trade Center bombing, explosives used containing cyanide together with the explosive. I have to add that no confirmation for any formal authorities for such a case. So just to mention the idea that mixing of explosives and chemicals is a potential threat. The Shirinikos Act released sarin in an apartment in Matsumoto. Seven people died, 144 civilians were injured. For my opinion, this was a turnkey point because it was the first time that a terrorist organization turned use to classical chemical warfare agent. And in a minute I will refer what is a classical warfare agent. 1995, Tokyo, Japan, again, the same act, at this time in the subway, only 12 innocent people were died, but 5,000 were casualties. Such a number, for my opinion, definitely caused panic, especially if you're not ready to cope with such a threat. 2006, again, chlorine in Iraq. They didn't succeed with that as well, and it was an inefficient way to increase the number of casualties. We heard also in Israel some cases during the last 15 years. We had the mercury poisoning of orange between 2001 to 2006, the suicide detector with residual of pesticide on the additive of the IEDs, and food poisoning attempts in restaurants as well. So, to summary, the terror organization would like to achieve mass destruction and mass impact, but the goal of this scenario is to cause panic, and what is a panic is a huge discussion. So let's start with the characteristics of the chemical agents. I would like to divide the chemicals to two main groups. The chemical warfare agent, the CWA, which includes, of course, the nerve agent, the master agent, the cyanide, and the phosgene. On the other side, the toxic industrial materials, the TICs. Of course, the classic chemical warfare agent usually owned by states, and the toxic industrial chemicals used by the industry. Among those toxic industrial chemical agents, chemical compound, there is thousands of compounds. Some of them has a very high toxicity and very high, and they are harmful and very dangerous as well. You can see also that they act on the same physiological system. The nerve agent, of course, acting on the nerve system, it's the same as a pesticide does. The level of damage depends on the type of chemical in terms of toxicity and volatility. Exposure to dose is a function of time and the level of concentration. Route of exposure can be respiratory system, skin absorption, eyes, physical condition, influence as well, like age, gender, health, and weather condition, a very important parameter in this field. The pattern of blister agent and irritants as well are expressed by huge blisters, are very painful, as you can imagine, for this picture. The clinical presentation for nerve agents, start with ocular disturbances like meiosis, then with a high dose, when the victims accept higher dose, it will continue with hypersecretion and seizures and convulsions. And if he will not get the correct, the professional, the quick treatment, he of course will die. I would like to take only 1 minute in order to show a short clip from the CNN report in order to feel a bit what is a chemical attack looks like.
Few seconds long. It's from eastern Ghouta. It's a close-up of a face of a boy who appears to be in the midst of a severe reaction. Again, these images are difficult to watch. We are showing them to you because it is part of what senators and members of the House are being shown as they make their decision. Video number 6 is approximately 2 minutes long. This boy in the red shirt, he appears to be having convulsions. He's maybe 5 years old. Very upsetting image. The intelligence community has told senators that these have been verified as authentic. Video number 7 is approximately 18 seconds long, filmed in the Damascus suburb of Kafr Batna.
Enough, no doubt, it is a very shocking and horrifying pictures. And at this point, I would like to ask only one question. Is it considered to be a red line violation? In order to describe the principle of the dissemination, I would like to assume that any attacks will start with a spill, with a liquid spill. And the size of the paddle is not important to me at this moment for my presentation. The liquid is spilled, for example, from a missile during wartime, and it can be spilled as well from plastic bag or a bottle during a terror act. The efficiency of the decimation is, of course, it depends on the dispersion. The efficiency of the dispersion means the environmental conditions and the type of agent. As the liquid reaches to the ground, it starts to evaporate. And this evaporation generates actually cloud. I would like to call this cloud the initial cloud. The initial cloud exists a few seconds, sometimes a minute. The cloud is very concentrated and usually mixed with aerosols. Following the wind direction and the wind velocity, the cloud starts to move in the atmosphere and actually generate ground contamination. This ground contamination becomes the source for the second cloud. This cloud can exist, although it's diluted and maybe not so concentrated, it's diluted, and it can stay for a long time and long distance and become harmful as well. The scene during a conventional explosion is totally different. Explosion revealed with shockwave, quick transformation, quick pressure transformation, and damage that can be observed from the debris, nails, and so on. I would like to classify the conventional scene in terms of confined scene. Confined in time, very short, we have a start point and an end point, and confined with casualties. Those who were unfortunately had been in the explosion area were hurt. Those who were lucky enough and were outside from this area was not in danger anymore. Schematically, it is very easy to draw the hot zone and the cold zone. When dealing with hazard material, it is another story. We have the cold zone with many casualties and massive contamination. Then we have the warm zone. The warm zone, I call it as a dynamic zone. Since the number of casualties can increase all along, the source is active. in that warm zone, we have to consider appropriate protection gears and decontamination ability to all the people who are coordinating and staying in this area. The cold zone, of course, has the same functionality as in the conventional scene. While we will add only one parameter, like the wind, we will get more complicated scenario. We will get what I call the cigar shape. The cigar shape zone can move, can change sizes, can change shapes. It depends on the wind velocity and with the wind direction. It is realistic to assume that the wind can turn over by 180 degrees very quickly. So to deal with such a issue, it's quite complicated, and you have to predict where is the danger. Just to show the fundamental differences between open atmosphere to urban space release, the rules are totally different, as well as the differences between the indoor and outdoor releases. Now, what happened since 2013? Everything was published in the newspapers, of course. In August 2013, the use of sarin during the Civil War became a fact. 1 month later, Syria signed the Chemical Weapon Convention, and the OPCW started with a huge operation for destroying the chemical stockpiles, the Syrian chemical stockpile. During this operation, Syria probably used chlorine gas. One month ago, OPCW declared that the Syrian chemical reached the disposal sites. Same month, Iraq tells UN the terrorists seized former chemical arm depot. In August, 1 month ago, the White House considered that Assad may have not overhauled his chemical weapon. So what's happening? Obviously, the motivation, material availability, knowledge, and opportunity are very important when we are evaluating the probability to have terror act execution. So what happened? What has changed? It is clear that the amount of toxic chemical material dramatically decreased during this year. And of course, it is obviously a very good sign for all of us. But on the other hand, we can assume that the option to take hold of toxic material increased. That is the outcome of the huge number of terror organizations on the ground and the difficulties of the international community to control the remaining stuff in the country. And we have to know that terrorists does not need a lot. About the motivation, it is definitely a function of the deterrence. What should be the lessons learned for a terror organization when the red line of using chemical agent was crossed? But nothing really has been changed. Assad is still in power, strong or weak, but still in power. Still, even if the probability of using chemical agent for terror acts is low, the consequences might be harmful, not necessarily with a high number of casualties, but with panic and fear effects. That is why we should be aware of the threat and know it and to be ready for it. Thank you.
It is a special pleasure for me to introduce the next speaker, Brigadier General retired Uzi Eilam. Uzi has a long career and in the defense arena in Israel. His most notable position was the Director General of the Israeli Atomic Energy Commission and the Chief Scientist and Director of Research and Development in the Ministry of Defense. Uzi is also a warrior. I would recommend that after the presentation you'd ask him about his role in liberating Jerusalem back in 1967. Uzi now is a senior research fellow at the Institute of National Security Studies, where he concentrates on the European defense concept, development in defense industry, and defense technologies of nuclear energy and nuclear arms. And General Eilam's presentation today is titled "Nuclear Terrorism, Is It a Real Threat?" ? Please, Uzi. I think, yeah, we just for the background.
Good morning. Thank you, Ehud, for the introduction, and thank you for persuading me to come over here. And I thank Professor Dickstein to a very thorough and detailed presentation. What left to me is a few remarks and not the substance that I prepared. I would like to first to come back to the definition of nuclear terrorism that Professor Dickstein talked about. We're talking about detonation of a yield-producing nuclear bomb containing fissile materials by terrorists. Some definition of nuclear terrorism include the sabotage of nuclear facility. I'll talk about it a little bit. In addition to what Pinchas said before, and or detonation of a radiological device, the dirty bomb that was mentioned already. But before getting into it, let me talk about the historical perspective story. In 1976, Rabin was prime minister for the first term as prime minister, and General Am Ze'evi, Gandhi, was his counter-terrorism advisor before he got into politics. And then I was just in the very first beginning steps in the Atomic Energy Commission. I came to Gandhi and asked him, why don't we do some research about the threat of terrorism? And he said, Uzi, God forbid, we shouldn't mention it, because if we mention it, they will get the ideas and will get into it. It took us another 20 years. When I went to a sabbatical year in Paris, in the Institute for Strategic Studies, the Fondation pour la Recherche Stratégique, and I initiated a research that included ICT, one of the first activity of ICT. Dr. Elia Carmon was part of the team, and the Institute of Technological Forecasting in Tel Aviv University, and we did a combined research of CBR threat. And even today, I think it's the only thorough research that was done, which come to show us that the dealing with this kind of a threat is complicated and not very clear what people are doing. Professor Dickstein cited the statement of Mohammed al-Baradei and the statement of President Obama when he was just got into office. Now, al-Baradei, after getting the Peace Nobel Prize, and before he left the IAEA, he said that this threat is serious. But what did he do all along the years that he was in Vienna? Next to nothing. And I'm not going to criticize Obama, but we should ask ourselves what the United States did, what Obama did in 6 years now in the office to do something serious against this threat of nuclear threat. When I was asked by Udi to come over here, he was trying to persuade me that I should talk about the threat. And I said, are you sure that I'm for it? So we ended up putting a question mark, and there is a question mark. However, the thing that we've heard from Professor Dickstein are very, very serious. And I will just go back to one or two of his observations. What could nuclear terrorism include? It can include acquiring of or fabricating of nuclear weapon. I'll talk about it a little bit. Fabricating dirty bomb, which is, in my opinion, even in the category of a terrorist threat is quite low. Attacking nuclear reactor by disrupting critical inputs, and it reminds us of some of the major catastrophes in power reactors, like the 3 Mile Island, which was not very, very serious because of the way the reactors, the American reactors, were built. So the radiation was contained there. But we do remember the catastrophe of Chernobyl, and it's still there. I mean, the remnants of the catastrophe is still there in Ukraine, and even the disaster of Fukushima, which was not man-made, but it was there. So there is a possibility of attacking and creating some results of radiation, of big radiation. And then there is attacking or taking over a nuclear-armed submarine, plane, or base. And I think that nowadays, with the ISIS on the road, many unthinkable developments become a reality. Let me talk about what is it that could be done, trying to fabricate, trying to amass these 25 kilograms of highly enriched uranium, or 8 kilograms that Professor Dickstein mentioned of plutonium, from which a crude device could be developed. It's not that simple, in my opinion. It is not just having the enriched uranium and then a bomb is there. And I think that if we're talking about the suitcase device, a very, very small and very small in potential of harm, it's not that simple, because developing or building an atomic device is not just having the enriched uranium or the plutonium. By the way, talking about plutonium, one should be very careful handling the plutonium, even the uranium, but enriched uranium is not as dangerous to the users as the plutonium, and of course, if the terror organizations are not caring about their people, and if there are enough suicide scientists, then of course this is not a real consideration. But we all remember, I think, those who followed the Ayum Shinrikyo in Japan, I think that one of the first failures of the chemical, the sarin use before they used they did the big show in the underground in Tokyo. They themselves were hit by the sarin, and they decided to lessen the percentage of the sarin in the underground, and this saved many lives. So the danger for those who are building developing and building is there to stay. I will not go on and enter into the details of how devices could be acquired, but one word about is it preventable? Can we prevent? Can the world prevent? And I think that the data, in spite, Udi, of my question mark, the data are quite alarming. For instance, we had hundreds of global addresses that contain nuclear weapons. The global known stockpile of nuclear weapons is 23,360 devices all over the world. The number of nuclear weapon states in the world is between 7 and 9. The question is whether to include Israel and North Korea. But even if we are not included, there are 7 weapon states: the United States, Russia, United Kingdom, France, China, India, Pakistan, and most of them are responsible. Most of them are keen about taking care of the existing warheads, but some of them, like Pakistan, and I'll get back to Pakistan, are not as reliable as the others. The number of research reactors with highly enriched uranium as a using the HEU is more than 130, and this is a big potential for anybody who is looking for either warhead or a fissile material. I promised, and I'll talk about big threats, and I'm not talking about North Korea because North Korea is something else. I'm talking about Pakistan, and it was already mentioned here. Pakistan got the nuclear arms. Pakistan has between 80 and 100 operational nuclear weapons. but it is going on and continuing to develop and to enlarge its inventory. Pakistan was, at least in my opinion, was allowing Abdul Qadir Khan, the Pakistani scientist, to sell the technology of centrifuges all over the world. And by the way, he was trying, when coming back with the blueprints of the centrifuge in Holland, he was trying to persuade Pakistan to go in the highly rich uranium development, and the Pakistani authorities of atomic authority did not like it, and then the president of Pakistan allowed him to go outside and to sell this technology to everybody. But the threat of Pakistan is not allowing another scientist to sell the knowledge of nuclear arms. The real threat is disintegration of Pakistan. Is Pakistan being taking over by terrorists, and then what? And then it is there, and then the whole world is suffering from a real threat. We've seen North Korea selling long-range missiles to everybody who was willing to pay. But we've seen North Korea supporting Syria in building a research reactor, which was bombed quite efficiently by somebody. And how can we be sure that North Korea will, in need of money, in need of support, will not go and sell their knowledge of nuclear bombs? So all in all, I think that to develop from scratch a nuclear device by any of the terrorist terror organization, whether it's in the way of Al Qaeda, Aum Shinrikyo, or others, I think that it is still far from being really a threat. But if we are talking about disintegrating countries like Pakistan, the threat is there. And this is what the world should be aware of, and this is what the world should, instead of just talking about it, do something about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Ozzy. I'm glad that the question mark slowly turned into almost an exclamation mark. And we saved the best for last. Dr. Eli Carmon, which actually I spoke to when I was starting, and I assumed the responsibility of chairing that panel. Dr. Eli helped me in proposing who should be the speakers and what are the topics to be discussed. So Eli, thank you. Dr. Carmon is a senior research scholar at the International Institute for Counter-Terrorism and a senior research fellow at the Institute for Policy and Strategy at the IDC. He also lectures on international terrorism and CBRN terrorism at the MA program Counter-Terrorism Studies at IDC. His fields of research include political violence, international terrorism, CBRN terrorism, and the strategic influence of terrorism and subversion in the Middle East and worldwide. Please help us out here, Eli.
Good morning. Thank you, Udi, for my presentation. And I must say that practically my involvement in the study of chemical, biological, nuclear terrorism, radiological terrorism is due in great part to Uzi, which together with Meir Dagan, General Meir Dagan, which at that time was the coordinator for counter-terrorism at Prime Minister's office, permitted the research, the first research, big research, major research about this threat for Israel. It was done in 2 stages. In the first stage, it was a basic research, and we finished it just before 9/11, and the second one after 9/11 about the specific scenarios that threaten Israel. Most of it was not published, although it was based on open sources, but we thought that terrorists shouldn't learn much from open material. And by the way, as responsible at that time for our website, which began to be active in 1997, I decided that all that will be on the website about non-conventional terrorism should be very limited, and including deleting many American and British articles because we thought that it is dangerous. And by the way, to understand how terrorists learn from us, when Ayman Zawahiri decided to develop a biological terrorism program, he said, we learned about it only when we heard the Americans speak about the threat. So we understand they are afraid, so let's try to build a biological project. Now I'll repeat perhaps some of the things that were said by Adam, by Gadi, and by Uzi, but I'll try to give you very quickly presentation what we saw, how we saw the threat until practically several years ago. And we were quite optimistic in the sense that the first research, which was finished by 2000, said that, concluded that there is no serious threat of non-conventional terrorism. It will be mainly a tactical one, minor incidents, but which can have, if you want, a strategic, political, economic, and social and psychological effect. And until lately, we were optimistic that the terrorists did not succeed in producing and using such kind of weapons. And by the way, we saw that 9/11 was considered a weapons of mass destruction event, but actually was not non-conventional. So what we had in the history of terrorism, first of all, our first research brought comparative, we made a comparative database about chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear terrorism. And to our surprise, and by the way, to surprise of our American colleagues at RAND Corporation and Monterey Institute, which we presented them, we found that in all 30 years, from the 70s, 80s, and 90s, there were only 292 incidents, not attacks, incidents. Most of them, by the way, threats, not real incidents. And this because the literature presented thousands and thousands of incidents which were the same thing, or they were incidents of criminal activity and incidents which were not really investigated by the authorities. So 292, that's all. But what's interesting, in the 70s, there were 120, but we concluded that many of them were actually, doing this, try to understand what kind of incidents. There were threats, okay? You see threats against weapons of mass destruction, nuclear facilities, only very few attacks, if you want, and most of the attacks were chemical, some of them biological, and if you look where there was these attacks, most of them were in the United States, 55%, in Europe, 28%, in Asia, 14%, but this was mainly in Japan, in the Middle East, 4%, in South America, 2%. The continents with most terrorism and guerrilla activity did not use such kind of, even attempted to use. Why? Because they are sufficient to use commercial terrorism. advanced countries, the industrialized technological countries, where there were the facilities, mainly, as I said, threatened facilities, were the big countries, United States, Europe, some of the European countries, Germany. And so nothing serious has happened in that period before 9/11. What we had as a first considered biological attack was in the United States again in 1984, a cult of Indian inspiration that had some political problems in Oregon, and they used salmonella to try to poison citizens in order to not permit them to go to vote and have some kind of control on the city where they were living. And in the end, only 750 people were ill, but nobody was killed. Then we have the issue of Aum Shinrikyo, and it was explained that this was a huge organization by its standard, a huge budget, $1 billion, and a lot of very successful scientists, but they did not succeed in the biological project. Most of their 9 or 12 attacks did not kill anybody. But the chemical project was very successful. It was very successful because they built some facilities which really are industrial facilities. They produced some 70 kilo of pure sarin, and they intended to do much more. And the first attack, if you we heard about the Matsumoto. It was, by the way, outside, you see, not in an underground, closed space. And here they succeeded in killing 7 people and wounding seriously more than 270 people. So this is really the first very sophisticated and very successful attack, and not the Tokyo attack. Why? Because they used this kind of truck, you see, prepared with devices that disseminated efficiently the sarin. And this device was used only once, and then because they were afraid of police, they destroyed it. They destroyed it, so when they came to Tokyo, they had to use the small bags of diluted sarin, some say 20%, some say 40% diluted, not pure, and they put it in the underground trains, and with a very primitive umbrella, they punched it, and the gas went out. So we had those numbers of 12 people killed, and not 5,000. So 5,000 were mainly psychosomatic people, victims. And if here they used the pure sarin with the same, or if you want, scientific device or technical device, I think we could have hundreds and hundreds of people killed. But they didn't do it because the guru was not prepared. It was an operation meant to defend the cult against the police action against them. Radiological terrorism is considered to be, by most experts, a very easy, perhaps even easier than a chemical attack or biological attack. And still, until today, we don't have any example. The Chechens, by the way, were the first one to threaten radiological terrorism in Mexico, in Moscow, in a park. But this even did not have a dangerous isotope. They said it's cesium-137, which we saw in Goiânia, indeed, was a very important and dangerous accident. But in fact, I think it was cesium-103, which is not so dangerous. And it was a threat. It was not a real attack. And instead of 4 containers, only 1 container was found. But there were 2 or 3 other incidents which were foiled by the Russians, but again, not so serious threats. Al-Qaeda began, by the way, with the biological project. As I said, Zawahiri thought that because William Cohen, the minister, the defense secretary, spoke about it, because, by the way, President Clinton was so much influenced not by only the Tokyo attack, by a book called The Cobra, which was a science fiction book, and there it spoke about a biological attack. So he decided, Clinton, to invest more in defense against biological weapons than against chemical or nuclear weapons. And by the way, William Cohen at the time said also that in the 21st century, the major strategic threat to the United States will be nuclear terrorism. And this was part of the strategy of the United States to defend itself. And Al-Qaeda anthrax program was a failure. We used probably mainly cyanide. They trained several people with cyanide, but nothing serious happened. And we saw even the experiments they made on dogs. And we have a movie, but I don't want to show you. I don't have time. It was very primitive indeed, not something special. And they were looking to support from other groups, especially Jamaat Islamiyah. And you mentioned, I think, Adam, you mentioned Safwat, the Malaysian. They had to take a Malaysian specialist in order to support their program. And the anthrax attacks in the United States. This was indeed the first real biological attack. 5 people died of it, and some 22 were injured. It was, by the way, a very strange modus operandi using letters, but this was a pinpointed assassination attempt with anthrax. But somehow, and the person probably which was responsible for it, because the Americans arrived at the conclusion that it is one of the scientists which were involved very deeply in the bio-warfare program of the United States Army. He was responsible for it. And the anthrax went out through the pores of the letters and killed or injured mainly postal workers and not those with 2 senators or media people which were the direct targets of this attack. But the cost of this operation, from the point of view of the investigation, from the point of view of the psychological and social effect, and the decontamination costs was enormous. Although, and by the way, until then, the United States West scenario spoke about 1 million casualties in the use of anthrax with a small plane over Manhattan or over Los Angeles or Boston. And with 5 people killed and some 7, 8 letters, the United States was not prepared and not able to deal with it, which also shows how although even a relatively small attack can produce such huge effects. Now, there is an event which is not considered to be a terrorist attack. In 3 weeks after 9/11, there was a huge explosion in a chemical facility in Toulouse, in France, which killed 32 people, 2,000 or 3,000 were injured, $2 billion damages. There is still a trial about it. And it was considered to be an accident. According to some information, and I have from a good French source, this was probably connected with Al-Qaeda, in the sense that one of those which were killed was a Tunisian worker who began to work only 1 week before that at this facility, and he was found dead with 4 layers of underwear, which was, and the police somehow did not look to his computer only after 5 days. So it is possible that this was an attack, but what's important here is the threat to chemical facilities. I mean, chemical facilities, and I had a movie to show how on 5 kilometers of roads between the city and the facility, hundreds of cars were destroyed in the explosion. It was considered to be like a 3.6 Richter earthquake. So strong it was. So this is one of the problems that we have, the facilities, chemical facilities and nuclear facilities. The conspiracy theory. Now, Al-Qaeda tried to attack in Europe, especially, we heard about ricin and sarin, which are not really weapons of mass destruction in a classical way. But why is this important? They had two plots, one in France and one in UK. The Algerian jihadists were involved in it, but the brain behind it was Abu Musa al-Zarqawi, the head of what today we know is ISIS. He is actually the guy which was responsible for the formation of the Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which was not, by the way, Al-Qaeda. It was his own organization, Jihad and Tawhid and Jihad, which he transformed in Al-Qaeda in the Levant, not only in Iraq. But he was the guy which was responsible for the sending of these two guys, Ben Ahmed and Ben Jalali, to Paris and to London in trying to organize this rising plot. And there was an attempt considered by British intelligence to be the dirty bomb, explosive with isotopes found in Herat in Afghanistan. I'm not sure at all that it was a serious one. They found only, not the device, but only the, if you want, how do you call it, the scheme of it. And there was a plot in 2004 in London by Indian of Muslim origin, which tried to use, they have americium, I think, inside these devices against fire. And I think he used some 10,000 small devices in order to extract this isotope. And it was a failure, again, because he would need some 1 million such kind of devices. But the motivation, the attempts existed, okay? The chlorine in Iraq, it was also mentioned. What's interesting, they used in 15 attacks chlorine and explosives. It was a 6 months operation or campaign, but they stopped. Why? Because most of the people killed were killed by the explosive and not by the chlorine. So they thought probably that it is counterproductive. And you see how such kind of truck with explosives on the one hand and the canisters of chlorine. And we come to Pakistan. Pakistan, indeed, is the main threat to nuclear terrorism. I don't think that at this moment we can see a change in the sense that Pakistan will become jihadist. Although we have at least two scientists, members of the Pakistani nuclear establishment, which had talks with bin Laden and Zawahiri before 9/11 and proposed them, by the way, not a nuclear program, but a biological project. It was very strange how nuclear terrorists are proposing an anthrax project. But the problem is, in my opinion, that in the last 2-3 years, the Taliban, Pakistani Taliban, and some other organizations have attacked military bases, very well-defended military bases, and even some buses or workers at the nuclear facilities. So they, by the way, ironically or paradoxically, these kind of terrorists were trained against India by the Pakistani intelligence. And they turned against their masters, and they have now know-how. They can perhaps penetrate in these facilities and not perhaps store a bomb, but take some material or even produce a kind of explosion by putting explosive in this kind of facilities. It is true that the Pakistani, by the way, consider their bomb an Islamic bomb. The Prime Minister of Pakistan, Nawaz Sharif, who was at the time the Prime Minister when they exploded the bomb, he said this will be an Islamic bomb. And you see here that on websites of Islamists or jihadists in Pakistan, they speak about their bomb as an Islamic bomb. Now, we come now to what happens in the Arab world lately. And we see that there is a lot of Islamization, radicalization, and a lot of alliances. And in a country where practically there is complete lack of control on the side of the regime on the one hand and of the groups themselves, which are very much divided. We have here, for instance, the biggest coalition, which was built in September 2013 as a result of the August chemical attack by the regime in the outskirts of Damascus, where 1,400 people were killed by this chemical attack, probably sarin. By the way, according to French intelligence, they have information only about 240, 250 people, not so many as the Americans, because the Americans took in consideration also the opposition reports. So this was a coalition which was built on the basis of this threat of the regime against the opposition. But immediately after that, they divided themselves because for the first time the Saudis decided that this is a threat to their own interests. So they built a new front or a new alliance called the Islamic Front or Jabha Islamiyah. And they tried to moderate them and to divide them from the two main radical organizations, Jabha al-Nusra, which is really the faction of Al-Qaeda inside Syria, and the ISIS, which became later the Islamic State. Yeah. And the problem is now you have also the Shiites involved. You have at least 7, 8 Shia Iraqi organizations. You have Afghani Shia, you have Hezbollah, you have Yemeni Shia involved in the fight against the opposition, but also they are not controllable people. And Syria, and the foreign fighters, I don't enter in this issue. This is the map of the situation the last month, very complicated map and complex map. And here we arrive to what happened in Syria. This is a map that we published just after the August 2013 attack. There were some 50 facilities where the regime had produced research and had storage of military chemical weapons, 50. And some 12 of them very important, very big ones. By the way, one, Al-Safira, was very close to the battlefront. The opposition was on the fence of Al-Safira's facility for several days and almost entered this facility. And the problem is that although the Syrian government has probably destroyed much, I don't think that all of it, we already have information from American and British sources that probably they still have some reserve. They can have, on one hand, they lost control of part of this infrastructure, and also they keep for themselves some of its infrastructure. The fact is that in April and May this year, they made a series of attacks with probably chlorine. The regime itself began to use chlorine and possibly other things that they received from the Iranians as a terrorist weapon. A terrorist weapon by the regime, which means that this gives legitimacy and perhaps also some possibilities to the opposition to use the same method. And finally, we have the ISIS, which has now control of much of the territory, including the Sunni part of Iraq. And in Sunni part of Iraq, they have occupied the biggest the Muhatna bases in Iraq, which was the main chemical facility until 1991, when the American and the coalition forces, together with the United Nations, destroyed much of it. You see what remained from this Mutana basis. The problem is that according to Americans, there is some chemicals left there. They are dangerous if the terrorists will enter it. But since their occupation, we had already 3 weeks ago, attacks by the ISIS against the Kurds with chemical weapons, probably chlorine, but it's not clear if it is chlorine, this is part of it. And the conclusion is that the situation in Syria and Iraq, this dismantling or the loss of control of so many facilities, the possibility that in Pakistan you have some kind of interaction between the very radical terrorist organizations and the nuclear facilities, here we have a new kind of threat which did not exist until 3-4 years ago when we spoke about the threat, and as I said, we were quite optimistic and quite quiet about it. Thank you.
Eli, thank you very much. I'm debating among myself how to take it from here. I'd like to do something unconventional. Mr. Jenkins, this is a pop quiz. I would like very much to hear your comments about that session.
I took pages and pages of notes, and these were fascinating presentations and extremely informative. Just a couple of sort of footnotes along the way. Analysis of the possibility of terrorist use of weapons of mass destruction tend to fall into three categories. The first are really threat advocacy, and I use that term as a neutral term. That is, it is the policymaker's perspective that begins with the possibility that this is a serious threat, and it reaches into a set of historical anecdotes that support the case that there is a serious threat. And I'm not saying that that is in any way dishonest. It just says there is something that must be done. There are serious consequences. This is a threat that will happen in the future. And so it is, that's the trajectory. There is a smaller body of literature that might be put in a category of threat deflation. That is, people who take the position that there is not a threat, and then use the absence of cases, or in some cases the closer analysis of the events that have occurred, to say it is less of a threat than we think. So the fact that it hasn't happened is used as evidence, or the fact that, and we saw an exchange here which is interesting, in one account, the Tokyo attack resulted in 12 dead from sarin. 5,000 people, in fact, were treated at hospital. That is true. But as Ellie points out, in fact, we know now that only about 1,200 of those 5,000 people were exposed to the sarin, and so the other 3,800 were there not because of exposure to sarin, but because of psychosomatic. And that doesn't mean their medical problems were not real. There were heart attacks, anxiety, asthma attacks brought on by the traumatic experience and so on. So what I'm saying is that people will use the same incidents in terms of case building. And then there's a smaller body of literature that begins with a question and does not start with we should do something or we should not do something, but rather tries to explore the probabilities or possibilities. All of these ultimately rest upon some assumptions about the future. Now, when I wrote my own book, just for the hell of it, I did a survey of experts in nuclear terrorism and what would qualify as experts. Some of the people, of course, here would. That is, people at the nuclear laboratories in the United States, some of those at the nuclear laboratories in Europe, as well as intelligence officials who dealt with this topic. And I asked a simple question. Just give me a number. What is the probability that terrorists somewhere in the world will detonate a nuclear device in the next 10 years? And you can all write down on a piece of paper what you think that might be. Now, the interesting results are, and these are the experts. The answers range between a probability of 1, that is certainty, to 1 in 10 million. So big spread. What is interesting is no distribution curve. It is spread right across flat. Now you can count to the middle of anything, even when there's no distribution curve. The overall one was 10%. But if you divided the Americans from the Europeans and others, the Americans were at 20%, the others were at 1%. And it's clear that the Americans drive a lot of these concerns about CBRN issues. This has, by the way, this survey has absolutely no probabilistic utility. It is more a reflection of us, not any indication of what may or may happen in the future. We don't know that, which leads to the next issue. For the analysts seriously trying to determine the likelihood of these events, we are attempting to assess that. It's extremely difficult. For the policymaker, it's easier. And that is, the policymaker looks at consequences of the event. And since the consequences of nuclear terrorism, or some of these others, are so terrible, that, in a sense, overwhelms any assessment of probability. So if I say this is a 1 in 1,000, or a 1 in 10,000, or a 1 in a million chance, if the consequences are tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of dead or something like that, doesn't make any difference. It's good enough. And so we see that taking place. Final point. And this came up in several of the presentations. It's a fascinating thing. What we do see is that there have been low-level events that produce, low-level in terms of actual casualties and costs, that have produced enormous psychological effects. And that's what really terrorism is all about. If you were to just think of this is a theoretical chart here, take all of the incidents of nuclear terrorism you can think of, from hoax threats all the way over to the detonation of an actual device, and you say, well, what are the consequences of those? You would have a concave curve that, of course, the consequences of a low-level event or a hoax are zero, low-level event, handful. But then, of course, as we got up into a real nuclear event, it jumps up sharply because there are real consequences. But if you were to take the fear and alarm caused by that and draw a curve from the lower one to the higher one, it would be a convex curve. That is, the lower ones are able of cranking up the fear very, very quickly. And it is in that lower register where terrorists operate. That is the manipulation of fear and alarm, so that in the case of Al-Qaeda, what is interesting, no question in the 1990s they were interested in acquisition. They were talking to people about making nuclear devices, about acquiring fissile material. As they were being literally chased out of Afghanistan, claims that they had nuclear weapons and their rhetoric about it increased. In other words, they discovered that, look, we may not be able to do this, but by talking about it, by threatening it, we can excite our followers and scare the hell out of our foes. And I would assert that somewhere in around 2008 or something, when Zawahiri was making his statements, that by that time Al-Qaeda had become an almost virtual terrorist nuclear power with no nuclear capability. And so these are just some footnotes along the way. One little question for you, Professor Natt, that is, you mentioned the test over Johnston Island, the starfish test. If I'm not mistaken, that was a 1.4 megaton. Yeah, 1.4 megaton. And the question that raises is, a threat coming from solar can really see it. Threat possibly coming from a national program certainly can see it. What would be our assessment of terrorists being able to actually fabricate a 1.4 megaton device in such a compact manner that it could be launched on top of a missile. And now, I'm not a scientist, so I'm way out of my territory here. By the way, on estimates of likelihood, the people who actually have built weapons tend to have lower estimates of the, they tend to point out the difficulties and have lower estimates of the probability than the people who are not. On the other hand, the accusation in the challenge to that argument is that those involved in actual nuclear weapons programs are looking at well-designed, efficient devices with a high probability of success, whereas the terrorist standards may be far lower than that, and all they need is a crude device with some marginal yield, and it'll be good enough. Thanks.
Brian, thank you very much. I will take the challenge and continue that discussion offline. I would like to thank the team here. Let's all move over there so we'll be able to watch the world premiere of the feature presentation that we're going to make right now. If you can take down the shutters and turn off the light. Don't worry, it's going to take 13 minutes. 13 minutes. We're going to be done. All right. What was it? Where is it? Huh? Where is it? Oh, that's it. Yeah.
Getting the things we need to survive wasn't always easy. In the old days, we had to work hard, and we had to work together. And sometimes it didn't matter how hard we tried. But when farms became villages, and villages became towns, and towns became cities, we could stop thinking about making it through the winter and start thinking about other things. And other places.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
We ran cables underneath the ocean, put satellites into outer space, and everybody got connected. But as everything was advancing, we were becoming dependent on a new resource. You see, today, for the whole thing to work, it needs electricity. We need electricity to pump the gas that moves our tractors through the field and our trucks down the road. We need electricity to run our factories, to power our supermarkets, and to do the simple things that make a house feel like home. We need electricity to control and pump the water we drink, to synthesize our medicine, put gas into our cars, and to light up all of the handheld modern technology that we've come to depend on. Which means that if something were to shut down the electric power grid, we, the people of the modern world, would find ourselves suddenly without the most basic things we need to survive. Everybody knows about how we are affected by dangerous weather on Earth. But not many folks know about how we are affected by dangerous weather on the sun.
A solar storm is a star quake. It's a powerful burst of energy that comes from the sun.
In the mid-19th century, we had the Carrington incident, which was a huge space weather impact on Earth.
Literally the only electric technology that existed at that time was the telegraph system.
There were sparks flying from the telegraph systems. Fires broke out.
The new thing is not the space weather. The new thing is that modern society is extremely dependent on electricity.
Big storms like the 1859 storm are going to have continent-wide and planet-wide laydowns and impacts.
The power grid could be knocked out for days, weeks, possibly months, even years.
Well, you can't go to the transformer shop and buy new ones. You have to build them, and that takes several months, a year perhaps.
The probability of a powerful storm occurring, let's say within the next decade, is quite high. We know it's going to happen, but we don't know exactly when.
And the sun isn't the only threat to our electric grid. In the old days, a terrorist attack meant Butch Cassidy was holding up the Union Pacific again. But in the modern world, the size and scope of terrorist attacks have been increasing. Nuclear technology is proliferating, and unstable nations or terrorists who get access to it can create something called an electromagnetic pulse, or an EMP.
The nuclear EMP is accomplished by detonating the nuclear device 20 kilometers and higher in the atmosphere.
The effect of it is much more severe than a normal nuclear attack.
That same single device that might devastate a portion of a city can impact a continent-sized area.
A comparatively small country or comparatively small group could cause massive disruption.
If there were an enemy that wanted to bring harm to the U.S., it doesn't take much to bring down the grid using an EMP.
By using a single nuclear EMP, our enemies could shut down a large part of our grid. But even without using a nuclear weapon, they could cause serious damage.
We now have weapons that can
create an electromagnetic pulse which you can carry around in a suitcase.
A non-nuclear EMP, if directed at critical nodes of infrastructure, could also create very unfavorable cascading effects.
And our grid can even be attacked without using any physical weapon at all.
Theoretically, a terrorist would be able to sit with his or her personal computer in France and take control over the Swedish grid.
EMP, space weather, cyber, severe terrestrial weather, earthquakes. We're talking about hazards that could bring down large areas of the power grid for long durations. Societies, as we know them, cannot survive those kinds of outages.
Whatever the cause, if the power goes out and doesn't come back on, just about everything in the modern world would stop working.
If we lose power for a few hours, it's kind of fun when people light candles. If you're without power for weeks or months or years, imagine years, it's almost inconceivable in the modern society.
We open the faucet and we expect water coming out. It will not work. And then after a few days, the sewage will build up. You will not be able to stay at home.
Entire distribution networks for food and medicine and everything that an advanced society takes for granted every day.
Hospitals will go down. Transportation will go down. Every gas pump runs on electricity.
The breakdown of civilized society as we know it would be very rapid.
If we don't have electricity for several days or weeks, modern society more or less collapses.
This threat of both EMP and geomagnetic storms has been studied by the Congressional EMP Commission. As Chairman Graham noted, this is one of the few threats that could cause the military defeat of the United States.
If the EMP Commission is correct, if the reports from DOD, from Federal Energy and Regulatory Commission, National Academy of Sciences, NASA, just to name a few, if those reports are all correct, then this represents a very grave danger to our society and our civilization.
There's too much talk about, well, we mustn't worry the people about this sort of thing. That's precisely what we need to do.
We have to get beyond the idea that it's imaginary and recognize that it's real.
It's always hard to imagine at any one time that our peaceful and ordered existence is going to come under threat. When you look back at those times when they did come under threat, invariably, or almost invariably, they were not predicted long in advance.
Throughout history, there has always been a moment in the life of every problem where it was big enough to be seen and still small enough to be addressed. That's the window we are in today.
So in the same way we put our minds together to build this new high-tech world, in order to ensure its future, we now need to put our minds together to protect it.
To evolve the grid to something that's more survivable, one has to protect the major components.
The 10 or 20% of things that we really need to protect. And then, of course, finding the engineering solution to achieve that kind of blocking technology.
The government has got to also coordinate so that everybody knows what they're meant to do when one of these events happens.
This is not rocket science. It's not fear-mongering. It's being sensible about where we buy down risk against this whole class of threats.
We understand the danger. It's fairly forthright to address it. The cost isn't out of range at all.
When we went out and started looking internationally, what we found was rather surprising. Some countries have really taken some very significant steps in addressing these. So if we can share information, we're all going to be able to accelerate the process.
We need the best ideas from the best minds throughout the world. This is a human-scale problem that needs human-scale solutions.
I see great strides in Israel, in the UK, and now in the United States.
The Prime Minister of the United Kingdom was asked whether he felt there was anything that had been left out of the national security strategy. The first thing he said was that he was worried about our vulnerabilities to EMP and solar weather. The United States has issued new guidance to the energy utilities. Israel has begun to do some really serious work.
We're starting to see the kind of leadership that's needed, but we haven't gotten near the threshold yet that we need to get to. Countries typically are poor at dealing with predicted threats before they hit. When you deal with threats of this magnitude, when you deal with threats that could bring down the foundation of modern society, you cannot tolerate even the first example of the threat. We have to use our imagination. We have to find a way to invest now in the tools that we're going to need when one of these threats happens. This is the only time when those tools can be built and put in place.
This is going to be on the internet this coming December, this video along with the ePro handbook that I promised you. On the 17th of September of last year, Bashar al-Assad was interviewed, and he was mocking the United States, and he said, look at them. I mean, we know that chemical weapons are ineffective, and they have taken away this environmental hazard for us. But we have something that can, I think the words that he used was blind the state of Israel. And maybe he referred to a blackout. Thank you very much. First of all, the panelists.
Could you give us a website, please?
Sure, yeah. Come down here. I'll give you a website. Thank you for being with us. And I don't know what's the Prime Minister, or you want to make the announcement?
Special interviews, highlights, and live broadcasts from ICT's annual international conference.